Hello, in this video I will talk about the Iroquois, or the Haudenosaunee as they call themselves. On the image to the left you can see the approximate area where they lived, i.e. in Upper New York and later around the Great Lakes. On the image to the right you can see their flag. The 5 symbols of their flag represents the 5 members of the Haudenosaunee Confederation, the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida and the Mohawk. Later, the Tuscarora joined the Confederation, becoming its 6th member. In this video, I will mostly cover the Confederation itself, but I will also talk about Iroquois culture, language and social structure. I will also use the terms Iroquois and Haudenosaunee interchangeably. Just know that the group called themselves Haudenosaunee, meanwhile Iroquois is the name given to them by Europeans, and you will therefore see them being used alongside each other in the literature about them. Before we continue the video, I have a disclaimer to make. This video is largely based on a presentation I did for English class in high school. I did get a good grade, but I am no expert. I am also not a First Nation or a Native American. I am Norwegian, so therefore there will probably be mistakes and inaccuracies, but I try my best to be factual and accurate. With that disclaimer out of the way, let's get on with the video. One reason why it often makes sense to call the Haudenosaunee for, well, the Haudenosaunee instead of the Iroquois is that the term Haudenosaunee means people of the longhouses, and the Haudenosaunee did in fact live in longhouses. A longhouse is a long wooden house made of elm bark. Each longhouse would have several fireplaces, and on opposite side of a fireplace there would be sleeping quarters. Each nuclear family would have one sleeping quarter, and they would share a fireplace with another nuclear family, as you can see on the image. Everyone that lived in a longhouse were related to one another and were in the same clan. A clan consisted of the clan's mother's extended relatives. The clan mother was the oldest woman in the longhouse. She was responsible for distributing resources and dividing labor among those who lived in the longhouses. The clan mother were also responsible for picking delegates to the Confederation, which we will get back to later. The Iroquois were, as I alluded to, not a single people or a single nation, but rather a collection or a confederation of lots of different peoples. It was a confederation between the Seneca, the Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida and the Mohawk. I now want to tell the story of how the confederation came into being. Please note that the story is mostly legendary, as the Haudenosaunee Confederacy states on their website, quote, "The Haudenosaunee Confederacy has been in place since time immemorial," unquote. So therefore we can sort of understand that this has to be legendary. You know, any such institution that has existed for such a long time will be in many ways quite legendary, similar to the founding of Rome, I guess. But now onto the story. Tahadaho, the leader of the Onondaga nation, was a skilled warrior who led his nation into many battles, but these conflicts did not bring peace. Hiawatha, a lesser chief of the Onondaga who had lost his family, sought a peaceful way of life inspired by the Mohawk nation. He proposed uniting with the Mohawks to reduce war casualties, but Tahadaho opposed this idea as war was central to his power and identity. Hiawatha then joined the Mohawk nation, where he met the peacemaker who had helped the Mohawks embrace peace. Together they aimed to unite the 5 clan nations in the area, the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida and Mohawk, into a peaceful confederation. Together they aimed to unite the 5 nations in the area, the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida and Mohawk, and turn them into a peaceful confederation. They sought the help of Jijonsase, a Seneca clan mother who was known for fostering peace among warriors from different nations. With Jijonsas's support, they successfully recruited the Oneida and Cayuga nations. The Seneca, a powerful nation, were at first hesitant due to concerns about external attacks, but most of their leaders agreed to the peace plan. The Mohawk, Oneida, Cayuga, and Seneca then formed a confederacy with the Mohawk and Seneca as elder brothers and the Cayuga and Oneida as younger brothers. Finally, representatives from the four nations convinced Idaho to join the Confederation by making Onondaga the capital of the Confederacy, giving them the most representatives and a veto power. This united the five nations in peace. The Onondaga, who held the capital of the Confederation, would host the delegates from the four other nations. The Onondaga sat closest to the fireplace and were responsible for keeping the fireplace burning year-round. For this reason, they are often referred to as the Onondaga Firekeepers. The two largest and most powerful nations in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Mohawk and the Seneca, were seen as elder siblings. The two smallest and least powerful nations in the Confederacy, the Cayuga and Oneida, were seen as younger siblings. Technically, the Onondaga were seen as the oldest sibling, but they were the same size as the two younger siblings. The Onondaga also had a wholly different role in the Confederation than the four other nations. The Haudenosaunee government was largely based off their longhouses. In a longhouse, two nuclear families would have a sleeping quarters on opposite sides of a shared fireplace. In the Council of the Confederation, something similar was recreated. The Onondaga firekeepers would sit the closest to the fire, as you can see on the image. The two older siblings would sit to one side and the two younger siblings would sit to one side. Now we will look at how voting in the council worked. One of the older siblings, i.e. the Mohawk or the Seneca, would come up with a proposal. Let's say that someone from the Seneca delegation came up with a proposal. Then the Seneca group or delegation would discuss the proposal and come to a consensus. If they did not come to a consensus, the proposal would be dropped. After the Seneca came to a conclusion or a consensus, the proposal would be passed over to the Mohawks, who also had to come to a consensus. If they agreed, then the proposal would go to the two younger siblings. If they also agreed to the proposal would be at last voted on by the Onondaga. The Onondaga had a veto, so if they disagreed with the proposal, the Onondaga could send it all the way back to the Seneca for another round of debate. If the proposal went through another round of debate, then the Onondaga had to accept the proposal and it would pass. Now, for example, if the older siblings and the younger siblings disagreed on a proposal, the Onondaga would serve as a tiebreaker. This is quite ingenious, as it prevented the powerful Mohawk and Seneca to dominate the Confederation. At the same time, the Mohawks and the Seneca were prevented from splitting the Confederation, as the smaller nations would not discuss a proposal before the Seneca and Mohawks agreed on it. I would now like to talk about how elections in Iroquois society worked. My understanding is that clan mothers would elect representatives to the Confederation. These representatives were chiefs, but they answered directly to their clan mother and were extremely loyal to them. To compare this to modern democracies, we can say that clan mothers were the electorate and heads of local government. Meanwhile, the chiefs were representatives of the clan mothers at the Confederate level. The chiefs were all men, but there were many different kinds of chiefs. In the same way, today we have different government officials like judges and ministers, but ultimately the chiefs answered to their clan mother. For the reasons we have discussed, like women's power in the household and women's power elsewhere in society, Iroquois society has often been described as a matriarchy, where the head of the household were women, and women often hold the most political power, which, as we have seen, definitely is true in Iroquois society. And this is in contrast to a patriarchy, which has been the standard for most of European history going back to Roman times. Although the actual practice of this matriarchy might have been more similar to a modern egalitarian society rather than a strict matriarchy, and the division of power and labor might have come down to more practical concerns. The Iroquois were not a single unified people, and they spoke different languages. However, some of the languages could easily be understood. Most notably, the Mohawk and Oneida languages were quite similar. I imagine this is similar to the Germanic languages. As a Norwegian, I can quite easily understand Swedish without any education, but I barely understand Dutch. But that is only because I speak English and some German. So a member of the Mohawk nation could understand someone from the Oneida nation, but would need practice to understand someone from the Seneca nation. I should mention that I don't have any practical experience with these languages, and the comparison to these Germanic languages is only to give context to these Haudenosaunee languages, which I think can be helpful, as most people in the world do not have any relation to any languages on the American continents. If anyone speak a Iroquois language, please comment and point out my inaccuracies. In Iroquois society, the women did most of the farming. It was an important job, as corn alongside beans and squash, which were called the Three Sisters, were the main staples of their cuisine. The Iroquois would also hunt, mostly deer. Additionally, they would also consume fruits and nuts to round out their diet. Generally, women would do most of the farming, while men did most of the hunting. Additionally, because they lived close and around the Great Lakes, they would also fish a lot. The Iroquois wore clothing made of animal skin when it was cold, and in the summer they wore almost nothing. Around their waist, both men and women wore belts made of leather, but other materials could also be used, like wampum, which is a shell found in the area that the Iroquois inhabited. On their feet they would wear moccasins, which were made of deer skin. Before European contact, they were decorated with shells and bones. After European contact, they would decorate their moccasins with glass pearls. What I find interesting about the Haudenosaunee is that they contradict the view that I think many people have about the First Nations. I imagine that most people think that the First Nations had a nomadic lifestyle and were peaceful and ruled by chiefs. Meanwhile, the Iroquois were not nomadic. As we know, they lived in long houses, which is why they are called the Haudenosaunee. They were also not peaceful and did in fact expand their territory into a vast area surrounding the entire Great Lakes. And their chiefs were also not the rulers of their society. The clan mothers were, and the clan mothers then elected representatives to rule the greater confederation. In my mind, this is similar to how the paterfamilias in ancient Rome would elect their local leaders and their senators to govern their society. The big difference here is that Iroquois society was a matriarchy as opposed to the Roman patriarchy. Thank you all for watching. When making this video, I was largely inspired by the videos Overly Sarcastic Productions, Historia Civilis, and Extra History made about the Haudenosaunee, even when I first created the presentation a couple of years back for English class. I will leave links to all the videos that they created about the Haudenosaunee. In addition, I will also add my sources that I used when creating this presentation. Everything will be found in the description. Thank you all for watching.